Hello everybody, thank you for coming to my journal club. I'll be presenting on antimicrobial resistance and the apocalypse that it causes as a whole. So basically, before 1932, it was a lot easier to die. If you cut your arm open on a piece of factory machinery and you contracted not there yet, if you contracted a bacterial disease, then it's basically a death sentence or a lifetime disease. If you contracted an STD like syphilis, a bacterial STD, there was nothing to cure it and you had it for your entire life. But then in 1932, penicillin was created and it ushered in a new kind of renaissance of antibiotic discovery. And it was great, and now we kind of live in that now. Whenever we get strep throat or food poisoning or any other STD and any other bacterial disease, it doesn't really matter to us because we could just take an antibiotic and cure it and go to school the next day. But recently, this whole pre-antibiotic era has been rearing its head once again, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So in August 25th, 2016, just about a year ago, in Reno, Nevada, a woman picked up a bacteria called carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae, more known as CRE, when she broke her leg and it got infected in a foreign country, India, and she brought it back to the United States. And after 26 rounds of antibiotics all failed to cure the bacterial disease, she eventually died of septic shock, which is a medical condition you fall into after severe infection. So this is just kind of one instance of many instances that we're seeing more and more of bacterial diseases that are usually curable that are taking down lives in our country and our world as a whole. So to kind of break down the whole antibiotic apocalypse, we're going to be kind of focusing on 4 focus questions. What exactly is it? Where it comes from? How it spreads? And exactly how big the issue is as a whole. Antibiotic resistance is kind of a hard concept to wrap our heads around because humans are really bad at looking ahead into the future. We only can live in the now, and this is a problem that we really need to have good foresight for in order to evade the catastrophic effects it may have. The goal of this journal club is to kind of make us all understand the upcoming apocalypse a little bit better. So what is bacteria? We'll start small. Bacteria is literally everywhere. It's lining every surface. They're just these small organisms. A lot of them are good or harmless. Can anyone name some good or harmless bacteria? Which is a little bit harder than naming sick bacteria. Yes.
E. coli.
Yes. E. coli can be harmful, but a lot of the time it's harmless. The other? Yeah.
Well, let everybody else come
Oh, okay. This one's like harder. Not a lot of people. We focus on the negativity in society, right? You can't think of the good ones. There's one called, I think it's Propionibacterium acnes, which just kind of lines the oil glands of your skin. That causes acne, so it's kind of harmful, but it doesn't make you sick or anything. So that's another one that just kind of there. So they're just kind of everywhere. Some provide necessary functions, some are just there and they're not harmful at all. And then some make us sick. So can anyone name some bacteria that make us sick or the diseases that they may give us? This one's a lot easier. I should be seeing a lot of hands. Like, what are some bacteria that make us sick? Yes?
Staph infections.
Staph infections, yeah.
Strep.
Strep throat, yeah.
HIV.
HIV is a virus, so not quite. Yeah.
Is tetanus a bacterial disease?
Actually don't know.
Yes.
Tetanus is a bacteria. But yeah, so there's a I'm sure you've all gotten more than we just named. There's a lot of bacteria that make us sick, like gonorrhea, there's strep throat, food poisoning, pneumonia's bacterial disease. There's a bunch of them. We'll be going over a few in this presentation. And then one other important aspect of bacteria that we should all know is horizontal gene transfer. So basically when 2 bacteria want to pass over a gene that has a useful trait or for any other reason, the bacteria basically just have to touch, and through the cell wall passes a plasmid, which is a circular ring of DNA, which holds genes that that can encode different proteins which do different functions. So buy one right there. So that's gonna be really important later when we're talking about the mechanisms. And then also antibiotics. So antibiotics are basically medicines we take that kill bacteria through multiple different ways. They could attack DNA or RNA production, which keep the bacteria from reproducing. They could attack the cell wall or cell wall production, which basically just destroys the wall surrounding it and makes all the guts of the bacteria spill out, or attack the metabolism, which means it can't really feed itself. Bacteria may become resistant to these by evolving or adapting by, again, horizontal gene transfer, picking up a gene that may encode it to be resistant to an antibiotic. So basically, there may be a bacteria that was once able, there may be like pneumonia that was once, it was once possible to kill that pneumonia with an antibiotic, but it recently picked up a plasmid that had a gene in it that encoded for a mechanistic difference that makes it able to avoid the antibiotic from killing it. So that's kind of the mechanism we're going to be talking about. But usually, one thing to note is that antibiotic resistance isn't like a rare or weird thing. It happens a lot. Like a lot of bacteria pick up these plasmids and gain resistance, but usually they're just killed off by the immune system, or we just find a stronger medicine to combat it. The issue is when this resistance either becomes viral, or when meaning a lot of people get it, or when there's so much resistance that it outpaces our current ability to match it with strong medicine or strong antibiotics. And yeah, so they may spread the resistance by reproducing or plasma transfer, like I said. And then what is it? Resistance is basically when bacterial diseases are no longer treatable by the antibiotics that were once able to treat them, and they become superbugs. And there can be multiple waves of superbugs. So one bug may become resistant, and then it become a superbug, and we find a new antibiotic to treat it, and then it becomes a stronger superbug. You know. So there's multiple waves of that. And again, it's a normal expected thing in small doses to have resistance. It's just a big issue when it becomes widespread and it becomes excessive. So to kind of illustrate this, I made this little like visual. So basically, just imagine that this is a microcosm of the entire world. There's the entire world's bacteria on a petri dish. And these are all pneumonia bacteria. So imagine this is all the pneumonia in the world. No one wants sick, no one wants pneumonia. So we're gonna put some antibiotics into the world just to kill some off, and it works. You know, we're killing off pneumonia. No one wants to get sick. But then in its place, there's red pneumonia. And red pneumonia has picked up a gene from another bacteria that makes it able, that gives it to the ability to resist the antibiotic we're using to kill off these pneumonia. And in its, since we can't kill it off, it's filling in the spaces that, in kind of the cavity we left by killing off the green pneumonia. So the red pneumonia comes in, and we just build a stronger medicine. You know, we have that technology. Develop a stronger medicine to combat this, or a multi-drug treatment, and we kill it off, and it works. But then we have the blue pneumonia. And the blue pneumonia picks up another gene through horizontal gene transfer that makes it even harder to detect using our antibiotics, and then it fills the place that was left. But then at that point, we don't have a medicine that's strong enough to cure the blue bacteria, and now we're stuck with an incurable bacteria on our hands. And that's a lot of the cases that we're seeing with the bacteria I'll be presenting later on in this presentation. But that's kind of a rundown of what antibiotic resistance is. Now I'm going to be getting into where it comes from, so I'll basically be answering where the blue and red bacteria came from in the thing I just presented on. So my paper is called Association Between Selected Antimicrobial Resistance Genes and Antimicrobial Exposure in Danish Pig Farms. So to give some background, the meat industry kind of has a historic problem with the use of antibiotics and antibiotic resistance. Essentially, the meat industry wants to make as much money, and other farming industries wants to make as much money as possible, and a part of that is lowering the conditions for animals. You know, they don't want to have to pay for deluxe pens for their pigs, or hygiene, cleaning them up. They just want to put them all in the most unhygienic, smallest, tightest conditions possible, in order to maximize their amount of money and sell burgers at McDonald's for $1. And a way they do this, because when you put all these animals in a small, confined, dark, tight, wet space, unhygienic, it's literally the perfect environment for bacteria to spread. So there's no doubt that these pigs are going to get extremely, extremely ill, sick. And so what they do is they overuse antibiotics, basically just putting it in their food to kill off all the bacteria, all the diseases they may acquire. And this is a big issue because it kind of is the activity I just did with the little pneumonia dots, but like on steroids. It just speeds it up super, super fast because it's just pumping in so many like rounds of antibiotics and then resistance, and then stronger antibiotics and then stronger resistance, just kind of speeding up that process very, very fast. So basically the overuse of these antibiotics lead to more resistance. So this study wanted to look into a specific relationship between antibiotic use and antibiotic resistance, and specifically in farms. So they analyzed 681 fecal samples from slaughter pigs in 5 different slaughterhouses, which all came from like many different farms in Netherlands. In the Netherlands. Yeah, so this is the way they broke it down on the paper. I'll just go axis by axis because it's a little confusing. On the right side, you have the different types of pigs. So a piglet is from birth to 3 kilograms. A whiner is from 3 kilograms to 7 kilograms. This is 7 to 30, and then this is 30 to slaughter. So that's how they kind of divided the different pigs. And then these are the number of farms. So 0 to 600 farms. I'll explain that later. That's just the way they're measuring the amount of farms that they observed. And then these were the different antibiotics they were testing, they were observing. So they found that, let's just say, in whiners, in terms of tetracycline, about 100 farms had no exposure of tetracycline, which is good. About 200 farms had very low exposure. About 100 farms had low exposure. About 50 farms had high exposure, and about another 50 farms had very high exposure. And this may seem like not a lot because there's a lot of no exposure going on, but keep in mind that this should probably be at 0. Like there shouldn't be any overuse of antibiotics at all. So when you see the red and yellow and green, that's where we're getting into dangerous territory. So that's the breakdown of the antibiotics they observed. And this is the kind of the connections they drew. So on the left are all the antibiotics they were observing. In the middle are resistance genes. So these are genes that are commonly associated with antibiotic resistance. If you see these genes are likely to engender resistance in different bacteria. And then these are different factors. So basically, I'll go over these in a second. But basically they found that, interestingly, there weren't just positive correlations with these. So basically, if there's like an extended use of extended penicillin, it upregulates TET-M, which causes resistance in different types of bacteria, which is an issue. And these negative correlations we expected, the upregulating of resistance genes by overusing these antibiotics. But there's also downregulation, which is interesting because, so tetracycline, for example, downregulates ERM-B and TET-O, which is interesting because if you just took tetracycline out, it wouldn't just be doing good by stopping the upregulation of these two, it would stop inhibiting these two. So it's a lot more complicated than we thought it was going to be. It's kind of like a delicate ecosystem of antibiotic overuse that we need to be careful about remedying because we could be taking out some antibiotics that are actually doing good. But overall, the correlation is that overuse of antibiotics causes the upregulation of resistance genes. And then these are some other factors as well. They found that the number of places the pigs have been before their slaughter upregulates these 2 genes specifically, which are there multiple explanations for. One explanation may be that the antibiotics that upregulate those genes are present in more farms. So the more places they've been into, the more they've seen those different antibiotics. And then number of finisher pigs. So the older the pig is, I guess, the more commonly they have the upregulation of TET-0. The mechanism of these aren't really explained in the paper, but this is kind of an overall epidemiological look. Are there any questions about this study? No, we're good. Yeah.
Could you just summarize it? What's the takeaway from this and what's the difference?
Yeah, the takeaway from this is that the overuse of antibiotics in most cases upregulates genes that cause resistance in bacteria, and that's bad. Yeah. So this is a kind of a news story that ties directly into this. Some of you may have heard of this, but in late 2015, colistin, well, basically in Chinese pig farms, they were doing exactly what I was explaining earlier. They're trying to maximize their money by keeping animals in the most unhygienic, closed conditions as possible. And in order to keep them from getting sick, they were feeding them colistin. Now this is a big issue because colistin isn't just a normal antibiotic, it's a last resort drug, which means it's a drug that has very, very limited access to it, and you're only supposed to use it if nothing else is working. Because if you overuse it and a resistant strain to colistin pops up, then you have a completely incurable bacteria on your hands. And that's exactly what they did. They kind of force-fed these pigs massive amounts of colistin, which eventually and predictably developed a resistance strain called MCR1, a resistance gene, which is now a completely deadly, incurable disease that's kind of being isolated around the world. And that's a big issue. And more and more of these completely incurable things are popping up, which is scary. So that ties into the study I was just talking about and how the overuse of antibiotics, especially in things like the meat industry, can cause big issues. So next, how does it spread? So on a bacterial level, obviously bacteria reproduce. Oh, yeah.
Could you go back one slide?
Yep.
I just want clarification on something, Miro. Is cholesterol-resistant MCR1 a gene, or is that the name of the bacteria?
It's a gene. It's a gene. That's the gene that's present in the bacteria that are resistant to cholesterol. Yeah. So the third focus question is, how does it spread? So bacteria obviously spreads on a bacterial reproduction level. So if one bacteria has a resistance gene and it reproduces, now two bacteria have a resistance gene. And then also on a gene level, so if one bacteria has a resistance gene and it horizontally transfers it to another bacteria, now those two have a resistance gene. And then what we're going to be talking about in this section kind of is how it spreads on a human level. So obviously there are bacterial infections. If I get a bacterial disease and I come to school the next day, I could spread it that way, human-to-human contact. And then another way is sexual transmission. Here are the STDs I was talking about earlier. This is becoming a bigger issue because my next paper is called Antimicrobial Resistance in Neisseria Gonorrhea, a Global Surveillance and a Call for International Collaborative Action. Recently, this past summer, gonorrhea has been recognized as kind of a priority one, very, very critical antibiotic resistant bacteria. The World Health Organization and the Global Gonococcal Antimicrobial Surveillance Program, or GASP, they collected data on this resistance and kind of put together maps of where gonorrhea was resistant to the different types of drugs that was used to treat it. Who, like the World Health Organization, released a call, like a desperate call for new antibiotics, because that's how severe this situation is getting. They said data from 77 countries show that the antibiotic resistance is making gonorrhea, a commonly sexually transmitted infection, much harder and sometimes impossible to treat. So this is a very, very recent development. This paper was published in the past 2 months, and I can't really explain the mechanism of it to you guys yet because that's how new and fresh off the press it is. But it also shows how relevant this issue is. That we have bacteria like this kind of climbing in very recent months about as like priority one issues in our world. So these are the maps that they collected. We'll go over these two first. Azithromycin and ciprofloxacin are the first line of defense you use if you have gonorrhea. So if you contract gonorrhea, these are the ones that are first prescribed to you. And it's a big issue because we're seeing that, especially with ciprofloxacin, countries are developing like massive amounts of resistance to these. In terms of azithromycin, you have countries with up to 30% resistance to it. So 30% of all gonorrhea strains in whatever country is orange is resistant to azithromycin, which isn't good because then you need to default to the next two treatments. Ciprofloxacin is even worse off. You have countries that are literally almost 71 to 100% resistant to it. It's basically becoming obsolete in terms of treatment. And then the biggest issue is with cephalosporin. This is the last, I put stars next to it. This is like the last resort treatment you use if you have gonorrhea. If these two don't work, this is the strongest one you use that's on the market at the moment. There are more like ones that you could be prescribed by like a doctor only, but these are like the ones that are like on the market treatments. And there's even resistance to these. In China, there's a 6 to 30% level of resistance among gonorrhea in that country. Yeah.
I know you talked about stronger versus weaker antibiotics
Yeah.
throughout the presentation. When you say stronger, is it just that more particular antibiotics can also like screw with you a little bit? Would stronger antibiotics also like screw with your body more than?
Do you mean strong antibiotics or strong bacteria?
Stronger antibiotics.
Stronger antibiotics are basically just kind of developed to attack the bacteria when it's reached a point where it's like, so I'll give an example actually to explain this better. So colistin, I was talking about colistin earlier, right? The reason that was like a very strong last resort antibiotic was because it was so strong that it would like damage your liver if you took it. So that's why it was used in such small doses because it was strong that it would have other negative effects on your body. And therefore it would be used as like a last resort. So yeah, strong bacteria can have like negative effects on your body, and they're also just like overall more industrial, like cruder. You don't want to put them in your body as much as you want to put in like any other treatment. But yeah, so these maps show a big issue because there's just resistance popping out everywhere at all levels of on all levels of treatment. So basically, this has been coined super gonorrhea over the past summer by the New York Times in a recent article. It's been on the rise for years, but it's just kind of reached a peak this last summer. The one important aspect of super gonorrhea is the throat. So the throat has become kind of a silent reservoir for this bacteria for a few reasons. The first is because people rarely use protection for oral sex. A recent study showed that only 70% of U.S. teens and 82% of U.S. adults, they all forego condoms, which is like the vast majority of the population, which means it's very, very easy. That's exactly what an incurable disease wants you to do, have unprotected sex. And then also because oral gonorrhea, in collaboration with this point, has very little symptoms. So you're having unprotected sex, and then also you don't show symptoms, so you don't even know that you're passing on this disease unprotectedly. And that's also, that kind of makes the perfect storm. And then one last part of this is, so why might, question for you guys, why might the throat as a reservoir be particularly problematic? This kind of vague, so I'll give you a hint. Like, think of all the bacteria that reside in the back of your throat. Why would putting gonorrhea back there be even worse? Yeah.
Well, you're talking about like in those pig farms, the conditions are perfect for that because it's dark, it's moist, and especially near through, like there's a lot of bacteria because where your food is.
Yeah.
Like just perfect conditions and
That's part of it. Any other guesses? Yeah.
Is your throat off?
That's true. That's another issue. That wasn't what I was gonna say, but that's very true. What I was gonna say is that while you're in the back of the throat, since there's so many genes, remember I talked about horizontal gene transfer, how they get past genes just by like touching and past traits. There are so many other bacteria in the back of your throat along with the gonorrhea that who knows what genes are being passed around. And one of these genes that are like horizontally transferred into the gonorrhea may be a resistance gene that makes it incurable at a different level. So that's just not good when you have a bunch of different bacteria kind of in the same place passing around useful traits, kind of like collaborating against you. So yeah, 30% of all strains of gonorrhea are resistant to at least one of the 3 treatments I showed, which is an issue because that makes it about, I think it was 1 or 2% resistant to all of them. And at that point, that doesn't mean you're gonna die or anything because there are very, very like, just like colistin, there are very, very like off the counter, doctors only, like very, very, very high security treatments that can be used and given to you. That's only if you're like literally about to die. And again, we don't want to overuse these last resort treatments because if you overuse these last resort treatments, that's what happened with colistin. Then you have an incurable, and if resistance pops up, then you have an incurable disease on your hands. And we're gonna have to start using these more and more as these 3 treatments I showed earlier start to fail. So that's kind of an issue that we're heading towards. And then finally, how big is this problem? So in the USA, 2 million people become infected with a bacteria that is resistant to some antibiotic, and then each year 2,300 people die from antibiotic resistance. And the World Health Organization created this kind of list called the Dirty Dozens, what they called it, of the priority 1, 2, and 3 bacteria, like the ones that are becoming the most resistant and the most problematic. I'm not going to read off all of them, but basically this was published at the beginning of the year, and you'll see that gonorrhea is at the bottom of priority 2. If this were published now, gonorrhea would probably be definitely priority 1, which just shows how relevant and like current this issue is. The fact that over the course of a year, we could see massive changes in this definitive list. Any questions? Okay. So just a quick overview what it is. So bacteria evolves to develop resistance from antibiotics that were once used to treat it. Where does it come from? So the overuse of antibiotics can allow for the faster development of resistant strains and the kind of the proliferation of resistance genes, like we saw in the pig farms. And this kind of creates and promotes resistant genes, yeah. And then how it spreads. So there's bacterial reproduction, there's horizontal gene transfer, and then there's human contact through things like sexual transmission with gonorrhea. And then how big is this problem? Over 20,000 deaths and 2 million cases in the United States. So finally, what should we do? So I've been kind of, we'll get to that. So these are kind of a list of things that we can do just as like everyday citizens to combat this issue. So we could advocate for policy that's against the misuse of antibiotics. So whether it's kind of condemning doctors that overprescribe antibiotics, or it's fighting against or signing a petition against a farm that abuses antibiotics. Those are things that can help combat this issue. Importantly, there's sexual education, so use protection. It doesn't have to be this protection. There's different types. Just make sure when you're in a world where incurable STDs are going around, it's a very, very bad idea to keep yourself unprotected. And by protecting yourself, you could be kind of fighting this issue by isolating the diseases. Cleanliness is important, especially in hospitals. Hospitals are known to be like a very specific kind of breeding ground for bacteria, just because there's so many different open bodies spreading all these different bacteria just everywhere. So it's important to keep our places clean. Kind of relates to point A, but support food industries that don't spread resistance and don't exploit antibiotics. I don't do this, but if you're a vegan, like congratulations, you're fighting antibiotic resistance. But yeah, like the meat industry and the fish farming industry, they all kind of fight antibiotic resistance. Oh no, by avoiding them, they promote antibiotic resistance. So by boycotting them, you'd be kind of fighting this issue. And then this one I like, change the culture of antibiotic use. This isn't gonna fix the issue or the apocalypse, but if you get sick, just suck it up. You don't have to take a medicine. Depends on the sickness. But like
fever, you don't suck it up.
Yeah. But
Especially don't come to school.
Yeah, you don't come to school. But sometimes, in some cases, it's more important to kind of heal on your own, and that would make your immune system stronger, and it also just wouldn't promote the overuse of antibiotics. And this relates to all different types of things, so like painkillers. If you have a headache, sometimes you should just suck it up and not take the, take the Advil.
I have one question. You said we have to wait. Do you know the timeline from antibiotic research and development to market?
Yeah, so it's a long time. I presented last year on this thing called Texobactin, which is like a new type of antibiotic that was discovered through culturing it just straight from the ground, and it still hasn't been FDA approved yet. That's kind of like the next place that we'll be going in terms of antibiotic discovery. But again, we have this really great antibiotic on the waiting list, and it still isn't approved yet, and the issue's getting worse. So unfortunately, the production of antibiotics is much outpaced by the production of resistance. Time. Yeah, we're done basically. Thank you.